the title of my talk is Refugee Protection and the Problem of Indeterminacy. So I will try to, this is an ongoing research I'm doing within a project which is based here and which employs me as a postdoctoral fellow. And I will try to explain what indeterminacy is, why this is a problem, and how this relates to protection, refugee protection in the world. This is very much new to me as well, so I would appreciate any questions and comments. And what I would like to get at the end of it today is to manage to explain a little bit how I see this problem and how I think we should begin tackle it and propose solutions to it, far from proposing solutions to it. This is what philosophy is. Right, so I will begin with describing a little bit what I think about movement of people around the world, movement as a general term, and I will describe this as in going under three main categories. I will then go and relate to the only category of forced movement, the one that I'm interested in today. However, two aspects when it comes to the movement of people in the world are relevant to the discussion, and we should always try to keep distinct. First of all, the movement of people. So, who moves? What are the reasons of movement? How are those reasons met by those duty bearers, that is, those who are supposed to accommodate this movement, either by restricting it, by protecting it, by promoting it, and then, of course, explaining what these terms mean in terms of policy. The second aspect of movement, is precisely those set of policies that regulate the movement. So we need to approach those distinctively. I will go and talk about movement, and then I will end up talking mostly about movement that is forced. So, as mentioned earlier, movement is of three kinds. So, forced movement, movement out of need, and movement out of choice. The terms are already intuitive enough, even for those of you who are not migration scholars or who have not in depth studied this field. In my previous work, about a decade of research in the field, I put forth a theory that movement should be out of choice. So people should choose autonomously where they go, for the reasons they go, and states or all those entities that are so positioned to decide how movement should be accommodated should take into account this fact and this normative demand. Now let's discuss a little bit what is forced movement. So I will relate to a number of figures that who are academics. This is because we are academics, so it's much easier to understand movement by relating to people like us. So one example of forced movement is Albert Einstein's movement. He was, of course, we all know him, a very famous theoretical physicist, and he was a refugee himself. Why so? So he was already well known in academia when Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933. And because he was a German Jew, we may want to categorize what happened to him as discrimination, a form of discrimination. He was barred from his professorship at the Russian Academy of Science in Berlin. His civic liberties were suspended. His property was raided by the SS forces at the time, and also some of his books and some of the research material of his property was taken away from him. However, as he says in the quote, he was privileged to be offered a chance to study and to work in Princeton University. So he was one of the lucky people who could move in order to save their life or safety or well-being. So the reason this was a privilege is because at the time there was no structure to ensure that those who are so positioned to fear for their life would receive a safe haven somewhere or elsewhere in a place other than the one that threatens them. So to this point, to this aim, the 1951 Refugee Convention, so-called in short, is one of the first documents which is signed by most states in the world in order to make up or help those people who are so positioned to need protection. In the category of needed movement, which is the second category, I'm using those examples because I think they make us think already how they are distinct. I chose Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska-Curie. She was a contemporary of Albert Einstein, and she is the only person to win a Nobel Prize in two fields of study, in physics and in chemistry. And to the day, she most obviously is one of the very few, is the only one so positioned in science. So the reason I chose her case is because she was a person who moved from her native country, Poland, in order to study in Sorbonne in Paris. And the reason for her movement was perhaps not necessarily strictly related to resources, although when we discuss reasons to need out of need, we generally discuss those people who move because they lack resources. So we have in mind economic migrants who move from a country that is poorer in order to better their situation in a much better off country. But Marie Curie's case makes us think beyond this category of need, which refers mainly to the distributional goods, so matters of distributive justice. Her case shows actually that there are many more structures that can put people in a condition of need. So in her case, she moved because as a woman, she could not pursue her studies in science. In Paris, she joined the department where for a long time she was the only woman. And very interestingly, also after the two Nobel Prizes, when she went to ask for a job in the university where she was working and has already proven her credit as a scholar, she was asked whether, she was questioned whether she was expecting a marital privilege on the case that her husband was also an academic. So the argument from the rector was that we do not pass such privileges from husband to wife. To which, of course, she responded that she was actually looking for a job, not for marital privileges, a job which her merits were already proven for. So if we look at need from this wider category, we then realize that people move for more than resources, but also for all other forms of discrimination. Yet, forms of discrimination that do not categorize as forced movement because they generally are understood to be egregious injustices, right? If you think that a person with 2 Nobel Prizes cannot get a faculty position and is the only one without a faculty position, yet the best of all in terms of scientific merit, right? This opens up the context in which need is seen, but yet not in terms of human rights violation, which is the case with Einstein. So for this reason, I wanted to provide those two examples and to work with those intuitions around those two examples, where one is human rights violation, another one is injustice of any kind, and we can discuss it in a long way where we want to set the boundaries. Those are, by the way, also ongoing discussions, so this is why I'm leaving them open. And then mobility out of choice, and this is me, and you may wonder what am I doing next to such two geniuses. This was, of course, not the intent, but the reason is because I have actually some connection with each one of them too. So I was a Marie Curie alumna myself, because one way in which people move in academia today is through grants. And so by achieving a fund. And after Marie Curie won 2 Nobel Prizes, this grant was instituted in her name. in order to promote new scholars and, let's say, not necessarily proven genius to pursue their career. And the second reason I actually chose my case is because it will make us think around also the issues of voluntariness of moving. So when I defended my PhD in 2018, that is last year in Central European University, given governmental attacks of all forms, mainly under the form of bureaucratic suffocation, the entire university I graduated from had to move to Vienna and is right now on the way to moving to Vienna. And this is an important case, but also interesting because here it is not me as a unique scholar to be targeted by a government, but an entire institution, an entire university. And so, of course, being myself somebody who moves out of choice, I chose an international career. I went here, I listed a few places I went to, or if not all of them. In the last 13 years, I moved, let's say, through about 10 countries and 3 continents. I first went to Paris to study as an exchange student, and I thought, how wonderful and what a great experience. Why am I saying this? Is because I chose it, right? It gives you a sense of the fact that I wasn't persecuted and I didn't have conditions of needs such as the ones Marie Curie had. Yet after very, very many years, I arrived in Budapest, where my university is now possibly seen as a refugee university, right? A university that needs to move from the jurisdiction of a state into another in order to continue functioning. Such situations we have last seen in Europe, perhaps during the Two World War, so in the 20th century. Now, I will turn to the refugee situation, and from here I will start a little bit more specifically on non-determination. Is it too fast or too slow or good? Good? All right. All right. And are there any questions? I'm very willing to explain more during as I'm going, so feel free to interact. All right. So refugee movement, we hear about this every day. So I will not give any further introduction. I will start with what is the problem and the solution so far. So starting from the story of Louis boat, the Louis boat. This is the story of a refugee boat in 1938 approaching the Americas and trying to escaping the Nazi regime at the time. As it approached a number of countries, it was sent off, lastly by Cuba, and the boat returned with hundreds of Jewish refugees on board, many of whom were murdered back in Europe, because the regime at the time expanded quite a lot. And ever since, we think that offering protection is a special moral claim. So it is something of a fundamental importance. It is something more important than, things that matter a lot to us. For example, doing the job that I like, being in an environment that I like. Many things matter to us a lot for very many reasons, but protection is about basic fundamental rights and needs. And therefore, the 1951 Convention, which is the first document trying to address this issue and have states signing, most states in the world signed, and commit to protect people who are so positioned in a condition of need to receive it. Now, however, looking at the most recent cases, I began understanding one of the problems that has not been dealt with in the literature. So looking at the Aquarius boat, that was in 2008, do you follow international media here? Have you heard of this? There's been a number of boats that raised a lot of media, including international media, boats approaching the Mediterranean area, and that's where I grew up in Italy. Anyway, point is, the Italian official response in front of the boat, in rejecting the boat, rejecting the boat entering the port, says, it is nowhere written that this boat should enter a specific port. I translated this from Italian. This means, why am I to owe a specific thing? What precisely do I owe this boat? And why am I to owe that precise thing? Right now you already see two levels of indeterminacy. When you add the third one, which is, why them? So basically the question goes as in, even if we agree that it is my duty, as in Italy has that precise duty to help right this moment, even if we agree that Italy owes something very specific, then the third question is, why them? So the idea is, why should I owe protection to the specific people on the boat, given that, for example, there are millions of refugees or people who could be so described as needing protection? Yeah. So this happens because although states have agreed on the 1951 Convention and have agreed on having the duty to offer protection to refugees as a general duty, this responsibility, this collective responsibility, cannot fall on the world as a whole. It must fall on specific duty bearers. But then, if we accept the responsibility to protect, and we don't have any way to go from this collective responsibility into saying why and how specifically a state is bound to carry out a specific duty towards specific people, then we have in the world what we are having today. And now we need to distinguish a little bit between, of course, practical implications and more philosophical implications. Here at stake there are both, because some of you could question right now in this moment, well, but how is this philosophically relevant? Maybe this is just a political situation, right? States do what they do. They are not just institutions in so many ways. And so this is political. Yet, I still think that we need to give a response to this question. We need to, first of all, decompose it and understand it in depth. And then I do believe that philosophy should provide some responses because, as I will explain, current theories, the current field does not actually address this problem, does not see it as a problem, but also does not address it, yes. So, indeterminacy, to be a bit more precise, what I understand by it is a combination between the question 1, why me, and the question number 2, why them. The reason for this is because most theories deal in depth with why X. So basically, what is the content of a duty and for which reasons, but not the first and the third question. And this is what I will be calling double stringency, and I will argue that when we deal with fundamental claims such as protection, but fundamental claims of any nature, the double stringency is almost never justified. So what I'm saying is states act wrongly in actively hindering protection to refugees. And I also say how, by employing this indeterminate mechanism. All right, so we'll start our the problem with fairness is that I think it only guides us insofar as distributional amounts. So, to explain this concept, imagine we live in a very just world, and imagine we have only 2 refugees, and we have only 2 states, and those states have capability to welcome refugees. And so let's say Sweden and Denmark, and then let's say Giovanni and Muhammad or something else. And so let us agree that those states also agree on taking 1 each. But right now, those states cannot agree on which one takes. Right? So Sweden would say, no, I want Giovanni, and Denmark would say, no, I want Muhammad, and then they continue the fight in this manner. Why is this possible? Is because this is a different different problem. So indeterminacy is a different problem. It can actually obtain even when the situation is ideal, and even when we do not have problems of fairness and we do not have problems of fair share per se. Is this clear so far? How fair share could arrive at telling us, okay, we distribute this and that, here and there, in those places, with these resources. So those are distributional manners, distributional aspects. But it cannot actually tell us more insofar as who is to be determined in charge of somebody specific. So substantive and procedural justice, I will go a little bit quicker over that. Generally, conceptions of justice are much wider than the discourse on human rights, right? So the kind of questions posed by these theories is, should refugees be included? Should they be included socially? What does it mean? How much? Should they be included politically, that is, to become voters in a country, etc.? Those conceptions are much wider than any account on human rights. But yet they assume who the duty bearers are and who does what for whom, and give, again, no guidance insofar as which country should do what for which specific people. And it is the same with the procedural justice. So procedural justice is, in the case of refugees, that every person should be assessed individually by a state when, for example, they try to enter one state. But even if that state owes procedural hearing to that particular person, and let's assume that all states are just and do it, there is still no guarantee that this state is in charge via procedural justice of that specific refugee. So, for example, to give you an example of that, in Europe there is this Dublin system, which now I think it arrived at the 3rd edition. But one of the points is that the country that takes the refugee at first assesses the refugee's situation, is the one who will take charge of their protection as well. So one reason for that additional constraint on state is because precisely states would tend to not want to take charge of protection. Right. So we didn't find any guidance in fairness, in fair share, in substantive justice, in procedural justice. Now the third big field I also put together with one specific important article in the convention is the human rights protection. So human rights debates are very helpful to decide what are the bare minimums that should obtain, what are the priorities, what are the specific human rights and priorities among those. So for example, it is very helpful to assess whether in the condition in which there are many non-compliant states and many refugees in need, it is important to say whether, for example, a person has a stronger claim based towards a specific country based, for example, on historical injustice, or based on the fact that they may have already some family ties to that specific country. But it is also important to assess what are the bare minimums, even when those special claims, more special claims, obtain. So somebody who has none of those priority lines to enter because they don't have a spouse in a country, they do not have a relation of historical justice, what to do with the majority of people who in fact do not have such things. But again, human rights, those debates do not tell us why a specific state is bound to do a specific thing for a specific person. And the non-refoulement principle, I think, is the principle that helps us see more clearly that this is the case. So the non-refoulement principle is, for those of you who don't know, in the convention there is this principle according to which states should not decline offering protection to both like refugees or like Aquarius, but also to people who enter by foot and in other ways. People who could be, whose claim should be assessed and then decided whether they qualify for refugee quote or not. The injection. So for the same reasons, we find it problematic for refugees not getting protection. And here I take three premises that are analogous to the ones I began with, stated in, well, an identical manner actually. So we all agree, most of us agree, that states have some discretion offering care, type of care, extent of care. But we also think, I said citizens, but I think residents or anyone in a territory have a special moral claim to health, and I think we all agree with that as well, and that there is a duty of justice to offer as a result the injection needed, right? Take another example. Imagine that your wallet disappears and you need to enter in the police station, and you find two people who are there to help you, and you tell them, my wallet is stolen and I need help. So how do we do it? And imagine them not starting on, let's say, fighting on a fair share of let's distribute the work equally, or I'm overburdened and you aren't. None of those discourses. They simply fight on whose duty it is to do that specific thing. That is a very small thing, but this hinders the access to basic things. And when it does, my argument is it is impermissible. And it is a moral failure when it's done to the Louis boat or to the Aquarius, which is the premise D here. And it's also one that we began with, and we said it's one that most philosophers accept. Then the conclusion is that applying the double stringency in any context at all, when it comes to basic claims, such as protection, such as health, is impermissible. So this is the indeterminacy problem that is often used and we should very often avoid. Right. So methodologically, of course, I chose the case of Denmark because it helped me distinguish between fairness, welfare, human rights, and set those things aside. Because as we know, in a world where there is a large disparity between countries, between their ability to offer protection, the debate is a lot more complicated, and we cannot get to the meat of what we want if we leave those assumptions in, together with our framework. So, some implications. And how am I doing with time? I have a few more slides.
You have 15 minutes.
All right. So, I have used many ideal scenarios to show how conceptions played and how they were distinct and why they didn't match and provide guidance to one another. But what can we say about indeterminacy in a complex case like the real scenario, like the world we live in, right? With hundreds of countries so disposed to offer protection, but also millions of refugees who are also distributed geographically in not a homogeneous manner. So there are very many complications. So to this, I think, to the non-ideal scenario such as ours, if it is a problem for us to have the problem of indeterminacy unresolved, ideally, then it is an even much bigger problem to face this problem in a non-ideal scenario. And that is because states can also invoke all sorts of other reasons. Perhaps one of the suggestions I make is that states invoke that reason in order to just simply bypass bypass their responsibility. I also think that one of the main implications of this paper is that the Geneva Convention, which states how protection should be taken care of, but which also suffers of indeterminacy, is one such document that gives us guidance on what should be received. It gives us guidance insofar as there are a number of duty bearers, so states we know signed this convention, but gives us no guidance whatsoever insofar as how to do that in a non-ideal scenario. And therefore, I think indeterminacy should be an article in the 1951 Geneva Convention prohibiting states. She says, I don't dump trash and tell others, right? So here, to give the last way in which it conceptually twists one of the main problems in refugee protection happening in discourse, the political discourse, and in the academic philosophical field is that, and Greta Thunberg at 16, in my view, is not guilty of that fallacy, I think, is that those countries who say those other countries are responsible for the climate change problems, for the refugee, for whatever other international matter, and we do have so many international matters, well, those countries may have some claims, in fact, and those claims may be right. So Italy may be right that, I'm not saying it is, that other countries do less. Greece may be right to feel swamped or... But the problem here is, why is this question asked to the victim, to the refugee? That question, if it has any validity, should be asked to the countries responsible, to the rightful duty bearers, right? And this is what Greta Thunberg does. It says, you, sir, first, then everyone else, not others first. And then that perpetuates into everyone being virtually able and in a position to ask the same question. So yes, this is about it on indeterminacy. And thanks, Greta, for helping with that.